Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a truly extraordinary journey, one that takes us into a singular work of art, standing as a profound beacon between two colossal eras, Giotto's Scrovegni Chapel frescoes.
A fascinating subject, really pivotal.
Absolutely. Our mission today is to extract the most profound insights from the material we've gathered, to truly understand why this masterpiece is so undeniably pivotal in the transition from the symbolic world of the Middle Ages to the human-centric focus of the Renaissance. You sent us some incredibly rich material on this, and honestly, I'm really excited to unpack every layer.
Me too, there's a lot there.
So right off the bat, this material makes a powerful statement. It flags Giotto's Scrovegni Chapel frescoes as one of the most concrete and impressive examples of the transition process from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance in art history.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold claim.
It's huge, isn't it? Not just an example, but the most concrete and impressive. When we talk about such a monumental shift in how art is created and perceived, what exactly makes this particular work such a linchpin? What makes it stand out so much?
Well, that's the core question, isn't it? And the assertion, it holds up remarkably well. This work isn't merely significant for its technical brilliance or its visual impact, though it certainly has both in spades.
Right.
Its profound importance lies in its revolutionary narrative language, its inherent philosophical depth, and the rich cultural background it came from. You have to picture early 14th century Italy, Padua specifically.
Okay.
It's this crucible of fundamental, profound changes. Art, human perception, religious thought, everything was sort of undergoing a dramatic reevaluation.
A real turning point.
Exactly. And Giotto's work sits squarely in the midst of this transformative period, visually manifesting these shifts. Before Giotto, much of Western art, especially after the fall of Rome, became, increasingly abstract, symbolic,
Right.
rooted in Byzantine traditions or that kind of formalized spirituality of monasteries.
Very stylized.
Very. Giotto fundamentally reoriented that whole trajectory.
And Giotto's own approach, his philosophy, it's presented as quite revolutionary. The material we reviewed even calls his artistic philosophy and its application in these frescoes the first sprouts of Renaissance art.
I love that phrase, first sprouts.
Me too. It's so vivid. For us as viewers, as people trying to grasp the essence of this historical shift, what does that truly mean? What's the practical, immediate difference we'd perceive looking at Giotto compared to, say, a typical medieval altarpiece?
Okay, so it means he made a decisive break, a real departure from the established traditional symbolism that had been so dominant in medieval art for centuries.
Right. The icons, the gold backgrounds.
Precisely. Think of medieval art as often highly stylized, maybe a bit flat, abstract, focused mainly on conveying theological truths or allegories through, established visual codes and hierarchies. Figures might be elongated, their expressions serene or kind of remote. Detached, yeah. Often lacking a sense of real weight or individual personality, maybe positioned against those gilded, abstract backgrounds you mentioned. Giotto, on the other hand, he embraced something radically different.
Which was?
A realistic, emotionally charged narrative. One that placed humanity and nature right at its core. This is where it gets really transformative.
Okay.
It marks a powerful shift towards an art that mirrors our own lived experiences, our vulnerabilities, our joys, our sorrows, rather than just abstract concepts or distant, idealized spiritual beings.
Wow.
When you look at Giotto's figures, you genuinely start to see reflections of yourself, maybe your neighbor, the raw emotions you feel every day. He essentially grounded the divine in the human.
So, if medieval art was speaking in this sacred, symbolic code, Giotto was starting to tell stories that felt real, immediate.
Exactly.
And this wasn't just some artistic experiment he was doing on the side, was it? This massive undertaking, decorating an entire chapel, floor to ceiling, that must have been incredibly expensive. Who was the driving force behind this project that would effectively change art history?
You're absolutely right. It was a colossal endeavor. The chapel, it's widely known as the Arena Chapel.
Why Arena?
Because it's right next to the ruins of an ancient Roman amphitheater in Padua. Pretty cool location.
Okay.
And it was commissioned by Enrico Scrovegni. He was this incredibly prominent, incredibly wealthy banker in Padua, one of these powerful figures emerging in the city-states of early 14th century Italy.
A banker. Interesting.
Very. He funded the whole thing.
Yeah.
These frescoes meticulously cover nearly every inch of the chapel's interior walls and ceiling. It's a truly immersive, almost overwhelming experience when you step inside.
I can only imagine.
And the purpose behind such an enormous, costly artistic investment was, well, it was multi-layered. It beautifully reflects the complex societal realities of the time.
Oh, so.
Firstly, it explicitly aimed to secure the spiritual salvation of the Scrivenia family. That was a critical, often anxious concern in a deeply religious era,
Right. Securing your place in the afterlife.
Definitely. But equally important, and maybe more publicly visible, it sought to solidify and strengthen their social status, their prestige, their reputation within the highly competitive, status-conscious community of Padua.
Ah, so it's about piety and power.
Precisely. Both.
That's incredibly insightful. And the material specifically mentions usury, the practice of lending money at interest, which was considered a profound sin back then, wasn't
A
it?
huge sin, yes.
So this wasn't just a grand gesture of piety, but maybe a very public, very tangible act of atonement. A way to, I don't know, cleanse the family name, maybe mitigate the spiritual risks associated with their immense wealth, both in God's eyes and, well, everyone else's.
You've precisely captured a crucial tension of the era. It was exactly that. This massive religious investment was indeed a public act of seeking forgiveness for sins like usury.
Which was central to his banking, presumably.
Absolutely central. In medieval Christian doctrine, charging interest on loans was condemned as a grave sin. It was seen as profiting from time, which, belonged only to God.
Right.
Yet the burgeoning merchant economies of Italian city-states like Padua were increasingly reliant on banking and lending. It was the engine of their growth.
A real paradox.
A huge one. The Scriveni family, like many other wealthy financiers, found themselves in this moral dilemma, accumulating vast fortunes through practices that were, by the church's strict interpretation, sinful.
So the chapel becomes a kind of spiritual insurance policy.
Yeah.
And good PR.
In a way, yes. Commissioning such a magnificent, highly visible chapel adorned with these powerful religious narratives of salvation and divine mercy served as a highly public, undeniable demonstration of Enrico Scriveni's piety and his commitment to his family's spiritual well-being. It was both a deeply personal spiritual act and, frankly, a shrewd public relations move. It tells us so much about the societal pressures, the anxieties around wealth and sin, and the powerful, multifaceted role that grand art and patronage played in navigating those complex pressures.
It really paints a picture.
This specific context is absolutely crucial for fully grasping the Scriveni chapel's significance. 14th century Italy was, in many ways, a crucible of modernity. You see the rapid rise of powerful independent city-states, Padua, Florence, Venice.
Powerhouses.
Exactly. Fueled by burgeoning trade routes that opened up new economic opportunities far beyond the old feudal agricultural system.
Right.
And with this came sophisticated banking practices, the very source of the Scriveni family's immense wealth, emerging as this new transformative force. This growing wealthy merchant and banking class, sometimes called the new rich, found themselves in a unique, sometimes precarious position.
Rich, but potentially damned.
Well, that was the anxiety. They were accumulating unprecedented fortunes, establishing powerful family dynasties, yet they existed within this deeply, almost overwhelmingly religious society. So they sought both spiritual redemption for practices often deemed sinful by the church and equally social prestige to cement their newfound standing and influence.
So art becomes this tool.
A very powerful tool. In this light, art wasn't just about conveying a sacred message or simply decorating a space. It became a powerful, dynamic expression of these new societal values, a testament to individual prosperity, and a complex means to navigate the intricate relationship between earthly success and spiritual salvation.
Wow.
It vividly underscores how deeply art is a product of its time, intrinsically embedded in the social, economic, and moral realities of the people who commission and create it. It's like a snapshot of a society in flux.
That paints such a vivid picture of the dynamic world Giotto was working in, where art was a statement, a prayer, and maybe a bit of a power play all at once.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All of those things.
Now, moving on to his actual artistic vision. What's truly fascinating is how Giotto chose to tell these well-known stories, the lives of the Virgin Mary and Jesus. We're all familiar with these narratives, but how did he manage to make these sacred scenes feel so profoundly different, so new and immediate compared to what came before?
The distinction lies profoundly in his presentation, how he showed the stories. Before Giotto, religious narratives were often presented in a highly symbolic, often detached ethereal manner.
Like we discussed, the stylized figures.
Right. Figures might be iconic, serving more as symbolic placeholders for spiritual concepts, divine truth, virtue, heavenly order, rather than as, flesh and blood individuals. Their expressions might be idealized or even kind of blank, meant to convey transcendence rather than specific human emotion.
Okay.
Giotto, however, depicts these sacred narratives not just with symbols, but with vivid characters full of human emotion and experience.
Yeah.
That phrase from the source is key.
Vivid characters.
Yes. This represents a truly profound break from the more symbolic, static, and often otherworldly representations of the past. He sought to bridge the gap between the divine and the human, inviting the viewer to engage with these stories on a deeply personal, relatable, even intimate level.
So he's pulling them down to earth, in a way.
Exactly. It's as if he pulled the stories out of some abstract, distant realm and placed them squarely into a relatable human dimension.
And this radical new approach wasn't just theoretical. It immediately leaps out at you when you look at the figures themselves, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Our material emphasizes that Giotto's figures, unlike those flat, two-dimensional medieval portrayals that often seem to float, are three-dimensional, voluminous, dynamic, and possess natural postures.
Mm-hmm. Voluminous is a great word for them.
That sounds like a truly dramatic shift in how people, even sacred figures, were perceived and depicted. It implies a whole new way of looking at the human form, almost like sculpture and paint.
It is an absolutely dramatic shift, and one that laid a foundational cornerstone for centuries of Western art. It essentially set the stage for what we now understand as naturalism in painting.
Right.
Medieval figures, especially those influenced by Byzantine traditions, tended to be elongated, frontal, often lacked a palpable sense of weight or groundedness. Their drapery might be highly stylized, emphasizing linear patterns over the actual form of the body underneath.
More like decorative patterns.
Exactly. Giotto's figures, by stark contrast, possess this tangible physical presence. You can sense their weight on the ground, their volume in space.
How did he do that, technically?
Through a masterful use of chiaroscuro, that's the use of light and shadow, subtle shading and modeling, which gives them a rounded sculptural quality. Their drapery hangs naturally. It actually reveals the form of the body beneath it.
I see.
And this naturalism allowed the viewer to establish a stronger empathy with the scenes. Imagine you, the viewer, standing in that chapel. Maybe you're tired after a long day. You look up at these figures, you feel a genuine connection, a visceral sense of shared humanity with biblical characters like Mary or Jesus. You see their joy, their sorrow, their surprise depicted with a realism that would have been utterly groundbreaking. It pulls you into the narrative in a way nothing really had before.
So it makes the story feel lived, not just told.
Exactly. It transforms a theological concept into a lived, felt experience, something you can almost reach out and touch.
Now, let's turn to something that I think will truly captivate our listeners, especially those intrigued by the sheer mechanics of our creation. Giotto's revolutionary approach to space and perspective.
Ah, yes, the sense of depth.
Right. Medieval art, as you've mentioned, often struggled with or just ignored a realistic sense of depth. Figures seemed stacked or floating. So how did Giotto manage to achieve this convincing sense of depth, this illusion of three-dimensional space that was so often lacking before him?
That's a fantastic observation, and it highlights one of his most revolutionary contributions. In traditional medieval art frescoes, manuscripts, altarpieces figures were typically placed symbolically on a flat plane. There wasn't much regard for realistic space or how light and shadow might interact to create depth.
The main goal was just telling the story clearly.
Primarily, yes. To communicate a narrative or a concept through clear, often iconic representation, rather than trying to replicate visual reality perfectly. Giotto, however, endeavored to create a sense of depth in his scenes. Now, he wasn't using the scientific linear perspective theories that would be formalized later in the High Renaissance.
Like Brunelleschi or Masaccio.
Exactly. Those guys came later with the single vanishing point, the mathematical calculations. Giotto wasn't doing that. Instead, he relied on an intuitive, incredibly keen observational understanding.
So he was just really good at looking.
He was an amazing observer. He meticulously arranged the relationship between figures and their surroundings within the painted space so that it looked physically possible, believable. This approach, driven by observation rather than strict rules, provides a more realistic environment for the narrative. It wasn't just a flat backdrop anymore. It was a believable stage where events unfolded with convincing spatial relationships.
So things looked like they were actually behind other things.
Yes. You see figures placed behind others, partially obscured, architecture receding into the background, figures occupying specific ground planes. This significantly increased its dramatic effect because it pulled you, the viewer, directly into the scene. It
Right.
makes it feel less like a flat tableau and more like a window into a real unfolding event. You felt like you could almost step into that painted world, maybe walk around the characters.
So if he wasn't using those formal rules of perspective, no vanishing points, no grid lines, like the later guys, how on earth did he make it feel so real? Was it just a master trick of the eye, or was there some kind of underlying theory, even if he didn't write it down?
It truly was a master trick of the eye, I think. An intuitive brilliance rather than a codified theory. Our material clarifies he was far from using direct perspective series as they would later develop.
Right, that came later.
Much later. The systematic application of linear perspective was still over a century away with Brunelleschi's experiments. However, Giotto's observational skill and emphasis on natural postures and volumetric forms were nevertheless revolutionary steps in this area.
Okay.
His method of placing figures of different sizes and positions, larger figures closer to you, smaller ones further away, arranging them in overlapping groups that suggest spatial recession, that effectively strengthen spatial perception.
It just looks right, even without the math.
Exactly. Essentially, space stopped being just a symbolic background. It became an active element of the narrative. It was no longer a flat surface for symbols. It was a believable, three-dimensional environment where actions took place, where events unfolded with this powerful sense of presence and depth. His intuitive grasp of spatial illusion was, well, it was a revelation.
What does this tell us about how artists started to understand and represent the world differently at this time? It sounds like more than just a technique. It's a profound shift in mindset, isn't it? A new way of engaging with reality.
It absolutely signals a profound foundational shift in mindset. Perhaps one of the most critical conceptual leaps in Western art, really.
Wow.
It indicates a move away from an exclusively conceptual or allegorical understanding of the world towards one that prioritizes empirical observation and human experience.
Looking at what's actually there.
Precisely. Artists like Giotto began to view the world with a new intensity, studying how light falls on a form, how bodies occupy space, how emotions manifest on faces. They were becoming, in a sense, proto-scientists, exploring the physical world through their art, seeking to replicate its optical effects.
Interesting comparison.
This emphasis on what the eye sees rather than what the mind knows, often from theological texts or inherited artistic traditions, is a hallmark of that burgeoning Renaissance spirit. It suggests a growing confidence in human perception and reason as valid avenues to truth.
So trusting your own eyes more.
Yes. It laid intellectual groundwork that would permeate not just art, but science, philosophy, exploration in the centuries to come. It's about a new trust in the senses, really.
It's not just technical breakthroughs either. Giotto brings incredible psychological depth to his work. The material we have highlights that his characters show human emotions in a way rarely seen in art of that period.
Oh, definitely.
Medieval art, as you said, often felt quite serene, almost otherworldly. Can you give us some vivid examples from the chapel that really bring this emotional revolution to life for us? What specific nuances did he capture?
Absolutely. One of the most powerful, almost heartbreaking examples is in the lamentation scene. It's part of the crucifixion cycle.
Okay, the mourning over Christ's body.
Exactly. Here, the emotional impact is just visceral, raw. You see Mary cradling the dead body of Christ, her face contorted in the silent scream of agony, her eyes heavy with tears. Her grief isn't idealized or held back. It's a profound, tangible sorrow that resonates deeply with anyone who's experienced loss.
You feel it.
You really do. Beside her, other figures express their grief in varied, incredibly human ways. John the Evangelist throws his arms back in despair, his face a mask of anguish. Mary Magdalene tenderly holds Christ's feet, her expression one of profound devotion and heartbreak.
And the angels.
Even the angels. Up in the sky, they aren't serene, heavenly beings floating calmly, no. They writhe and contort in grief, their tiny bodies twisting in this silent, cosmic wail of despair, mirroring the human suffering below. It's stunning.
That's incredible detail.
To fully grasp how revolutionary this was, remember that much of medieval art, especially earlier forms, often depicted faces as serene, idealized, maybe even expressionless. The aim was to emphasize a spiritual, otherworldly aspect, an ideal of transcendence over earthly suffering.
Right, above it all.
Exactly. Giotto, however, made a conscious, deliberate choice to express the complexity of the human soul and its emotions. He brought the divine narrative down to an intensely human level through the raw, unfiltered display of feeling.
So not just sadness, but specific kinds of sadness.
Yes. You can see a wide variety of realistic expressions such as grief, joy, and surprise on his faces, even fear, anger, betrayal in scenes like the Kiss of Judas. These aren't just generic faces. They're individuals experiencing profound internal states. And Giotto masterfully renders those states visible through subtle shifts in the brow, the mouth, the gaze.
So he's inviting us to connect with the divine, not through abstract symbols or some unreachable ideal, but through something deeply relatable and universally understood, shared human emotion.
Precisely.
He's making this sacred intensely personal, and it sounds like he's almost creating a kind of dramatic theater on the walls.
That's a great way to put it, precisely. This allows the viewer to feel the story not as a legend or doctrine, but as a lived experience. It transforms the sacred into something profoundly human, something you can connect with on an empathetic level. It fosters a sense of shared understanding with the biblical figures.
That's amazing.
This was a stroke of genius that made the narratives far more accessible and impactful. It moved beyond just the educated elite who might understand complex theological symbols to resonate with the common person.
Yeah.
What truly stands out to you about seeing such raw, unfiltered emotion depicted in early 14th century art? For me, it's just the sheer audacity of it,
Yeah.
to break from centuries of artistic tradition to present a vision so fundamentally rooted in our shared human condition.
Right.
For me, it's the way it collapses the distance between the sacred event and me, the viewer. It's like you're standing right there with them, feeling what they feel, witnessing a profound moment as if it were happening right in front of your eyes. It's a bridge of empathy
Yeah.
that had rarely, if ever, been built so powerfully in paint before. But beyond the groundbreaking vision and emotional depth, there's the mastery of the medium itself. How did Giotto physically create these enduring masterpieces on the chapel walls? Fresco painting is notoriously challenging, isn't it? It is indeed. It's a demanding and highly skilled technique requiring immense foresight and incredibly rapid execution.
So no room for error.
Very little. The frescoes were created using the demanding wet plaster technique, more formally known as buon fresco.
Which means true fresco.
Exactly. True fresco. This involves applying pigments, which are ground from natural minerals, directly onto freshly applied wet lime plaster. The artist has to work incredibly quickly and with absolute precision before that plaster dries.
Why so fast?
Because once it dries, the chemical process, it's called carbonation, that binds the pigment to the wall is complete. It's locked in. There's no going back to fix things easily once that plaster is cured. Any errors would mean chiseling out the section and replastering.
Oh, wow. A nightmare.
A total nightmare. This meant Giotto and his workshop had to meticulously plan each day's work. They'd lay only as much wet plaster as they could paint in a single session.
A day's work.
Right, often referred to as a giornata. That's Italian for day's work. You can sometimes even see the faint outlines where one day's plaster meets the next on the finished walls. It's a testament to the logistical complexity.
That's fascinating. You can literally see the process.
You can. And the immense advantage of this precise and unforgiving technique is that as the plaster dries, the pigments penetrate the plaster and become chemically fused with the wall itself.
So it's not just on the wall, it's in the wall.
Exactly. It becomes part of the building. This process creates incredibly permanent and vibrant colors that last for centuries. Giotto masterfully used this technical permanence to enhance the narrative power of the scenes themselves.
Oh, so.
Well, the fact that these images were literally embedded into the walls, becoming as fixed as the stone, added to their gravitas and permanence. It made the stories they told feel timeless, sacred, unshakable. Furthermore, and this truly speaks to Giotto's comprehensive genius, almost like an architect of vision, the entire cycle of frescoes was meticulously planned with the chapel's architectural structure and lighting conditions in mind.
So he wasn't just painting on a blank canvas.
Not at all. This
Yeah.
wasn't just slapping paint on a flat surface. It was a grand, integrated design where the art was conceived in harmony with the building itself. This foresight meant the artwork was perfectly calibrated, integrated into its environment.
Taking into account the actual light.
Yes, taking into account the natural light entering through the chapel's windows, the curves of the vaulted ceiling, the placement of architectural elements like arches and pilasters. Giotto even incorporated some trompe-l'oeil elements, painting false marble panels and architectural bits that seemed to extend the real space.
Playing tricks on the eye again.
He was a master. This holistic approach was incredibly effective in drawing the viewer into the artwork and creating a cohesive, immersive experience that blurred the lines between the physical space at the chapel and the painted narratives.
Yeah.
This raises an important question for us, and maybe for you, the listener. How does the physical space of a building, its size, its light, its purpose, its very structure dictate and enhance the art contained within it?
Right.
In the Scriveni Chapel, the art becomes inseparable from the architecture. It creates this total environment for contemplation and spiritual experience.
It really makes you realize that the chapel itself isn't just a container for the art, but an integral part of the artwork. It's a fully designed, immersive experience.
Absolutely. A total work of art.
So what does all this, the humanized figures, the
Yeah.
new sense of space, the emotional depth mean for the bigger picture of human thought? Our material suggests Giotto's work is a visual reflection of a profound philosophical shift from medieval scholastic thought to humanism.
A huge shift.
This sounds like a seismic shift in how people understood the universe, their place in it, and even their own capabilities. Can you break that down for us? What were scholasticism and humanism, and how did Giotto effectively bridge that gap visually?
Okay, this is really where the Scriveni Chapel transcends just being beautiful paintings and becomes this profound historical document, a visual essay on the changing intellectual landscape of Europe.
Okay.
So think of scholasticism as the dominant intellectual framework of the High Middle Ages. It largely attempted to understand the world through abstract, dogmatic, and metaphysical concepts. Its primary focus was on reconciling classical philosophy, particularly Aristotle, with Christian theology.
Using logic and deduction.
Exactly, often prioritizing logical deduction from established doctrines and sacred texts. It was an intellectual discipline, rigorous, systematic, aimed at understanding divine truth through reason and theological argument, often kind of detached from empirical observation of the earthly world. It was about defining and categorizing knowledge within a divinely ordered universe.
Very structured.
Very. Humanism, by stark contrast, which began to emerge in Italy right around this very time, represented a radical new intellectual and cultural focus.
Okay, so what was different?
It wasn't about rejecting God, not at all, but rather placing a new emphasis on human experience, nature, and individuality. It was a shift towards understanding the world through empirical observation, critical thinking, and a greater appreciation for human potential, human achievement, and the value of human life on Earth.
More focus on the here and now.
Somewhat, yes. Humanists looked back to classical Greek and Roman texts, not just for philosophy, but for insights into rhetoric, ethics, civic virtue, celebrating the intellectual and artistic achievements of antiquity as models for their own society. It was a move away from the exclusively God-centered worldview of scholasticism to one that acknowledged and celebrated humanity's place within the divine creation.
So how does Giotto's art fit in?
His art perfectly embodies this humanistic turn in a tangible, visual way. How?
Well, he better observed human anatomy, moving beyond stylized forms to represent the human body with greater naturalistic accuracy, celebrating its form and physicality.
Right, the volume we talked about. Exactly. He reflected observations of nature in his paintings, depicting landscapes, skies, architectural settings that felt real rather than symbolic or generic backdrops. And crucially, he placed scenes in real time and space within the human world, grounding divine narratives in believable earthly settings.
Okay.
This is critical because art then moves from being an abstract narrative of sacred texts, stories told through symbols and idealized figures for teaching purposes, to a narrative fed by human life, experience, and reality.
So it's not just about God anymore, it's about people too.
Precisely. It stops being purely about the divine and becomes deeply intertwined with the human condition, reflecting human agency and emotion. What's truly fascinating here is how art becomes not just a passive mirror of these changing societal and intellectual values, but an active force, shaping how people perceive their place in the universe, validating human experience as a worthy subject for art.
That's a powerful idea. Art as both a mirror and a shaper of culture and thought. How did this philosophical shift, this move from scholasticism's abstract dogma to humanism's celebration of the human experience, fundamentally change the very role and function of art itself? Because before Giotto, art seemed to have a very specific, almost singular purpose, didn't it?
Absolutely. Throughout much of the Middle Ages, art primarily served as a symbolic communication tool.
Mm.
It was largely in the hands of the church and monastic orders. Its function was explicitly to serve faith and dogma.
To teach the Bible stories, basically.
Exactly. It was largely didactic, allegorical, designed to teach largely illiterate congregations about biblical stories, the lives of saints, complex theological principles. Its power lay in its ability to transmit established religious truths, reinforce church authority, and inspire piety, often through abstract symbols that needed interpretation by a priest.
The artist wasn't the focus.
Not really. Individual expression or naturalistic representation was secondary to the sacred message. Anonymity was common for artists. The work was seen as a service to God, not a display of individual genius.
Okay, so how did Giotto change that function?
Giotto, by enabling art to establish an emotional connection with the viewer, profoundly expanded its social and individual function. He made art relatable on a deeply personal level. He allowed individuals to engage with the sacred narrative through their own human emotions and experiences.
That's the key difference.
It's a radical departure. No longer was art just a means of instructing the faithful through allegories. It became a conduit for personal reflection, empathy, emotional engagement. The viewer was invited not just to understand a biblical story intellectually, but to feel it.
Right.
In this new context, art ceased to be merely a medium for religious messages that were just passively received. Instead, it transformed into an expressive form that reflects and enriches human experience in all its complexity.
Celebrating the human side of things.
Yes. Celebrating the human condition, its joys, its sorrows, its triumphs, its tragedies, within a divine framework, but with the new emphasis on the tangible and the personal. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it suggests art can be more than just conveying information. It can be about shared feeling, about fostering a deeper understanding of universal human experiences, and about elevating the human spirit.
It really changes the dynamic.
It really does. How does your relationship with art change when it becomes less about abstract symbolism and more about the vivid, relatable, sometimes raw human experience? It invites a different kind of engagement, doesn't it? A more personal, profound one. Makes art feel alive.
For me, it makes art feel less like something to be revered from a distance and more like a conversation, something that speaks directly to me and my own lived experience.
Exact, a conversation. I like that.
It's clear why Giotto is often referred to as the father of Renaissance art, after exploring all these profound points. But let's just summarize the key reasons our material provides. What are the absolute core innovations that truly earn him that monumental title, cementing his place in history?
Yeah, the title Father of Renaissance Art feels absolutely earned. And his frescoes really encapsulate this new understanding, not just in their technical execution, but in their revolutionary content and narrative.
So number one,
Okay, first, his dramatic arrangement of scenes in the story sequence. How he lets the narrative unfold with emotional buildup and logical flow that was groundbreaking. He wasn't just presenting isolated moments. He was telling a continuous story with a powerful dramatic arc, guiding your eye and your emotion.
like a movie director almost.
Kind of. Coupled with that is the psychological depth of characters, making each figure a believable individual with internal thoughts and feelings, not just a type or a symbol. Their expressions, gestures, interactions, they reveal their inner lives.
And the third main point.
And finally, that emotional connection established with the viewer, inviting empathy, personal resonance, allowing the divine to be experienced through relatable human emotion that truly pioneered a human-centered perspective in art.
Human-centered, that's the core.
That's the core reason he earned that monumental title. He fundamentally shifted art's focus from the purely divine and symbolic to the human and experiential. He laid the groundwork for everything that followed in the Renaissance. He basically taught artists how to paint humanity.
His spatial depth innovations also seem particularly crucial for future artists. It's like he cracked open a door to a whole new way of seeing the world depicted on a flat surface, proving that a painting could be a window, not just a wall.
He absolutely did. His success in creating spatial depth, even without those later scientific theories of linear perspective, explicitly laid the groundwork for the development of perspective theory in subsequent centuries.
So he showed it was possible.
Exactly. While he didn't codify it with math or diagrams, his intuitive revolutionary steps in observation and depicting natural postures and volumetric forms were foundational. Imagine him as the brilliant experimenter who proved it could be done even if he hadn't written down the formula yet.
Setting the stage.
Totally. He was intuitively creating the illusion of a believable, three-dimensional world that artists like Brunelleschi, Alberti, and Masaccio would later formalize with mathematical precision. His work showed that flat surfaces could convincingly portray volume and depth. That set the intellectual and artistic precedent. The simple yet profound act of depicting figures varying in size and position to create depth, and making space an active narrative element, not just a flat backdrop, but a dynamic stage for action that set the stage for all that was to come in the Renaissance and beyond.
Yeah.
He taught artists and viewers alike that a painting could be a window into another world, a world that felt as real and tangible as their own. This was a paradigm shift that reverberated through the entire history of Western art, changing how we even understand representation itself.
This deep dive into Giotto's Scrovegni Chapel frescoes truly highlights a unique artwork that brilliantly combines technical mastery, narrative power, the human soul, and the social structure of the era. It's so much more than just pretty pictures. It's like a living historical document rendered in paint, a mirror of a world undergoing radical change.
It is, yeah. And it stands as an undeniable turning point in art history. It represents that crucial transition from the symbolic and abstract art of the Middle Ages to the realistic and humanist art of the Renaissance. It's truly a cornerstone, not just for Giotto's own monumental legacy, but for the entire trajectory of European art history. It really set the stage for the artistic explosion that followed and forever changed how artists conceive of their craft and their subject matter.
This deep dive into Giotto's work really reminds us that art doesn't just reflect culture. It actively shapes it, guiding our perception and understanding of the world around us.
A powerful thought.
So a final thought for you, our listener. What connections can you draw between the shifts in art we've explored today and major societal changes happening in our own time? Think about how new technologies, evolving social values, or global events might be influencing the art we create and consume today. And how might it be subtly, or maybe not so subtly, shifting our own perspectives on humanity and our place in the universe? Something to ponder.